By 1850, Manchester and its surrounding towns produced more than half of the world's cotton cloth. Half. One city in England, barely 200 years removed from being a modest market town, now dressed humanity. The numbers are staggering. Over 100 mills, 50,000 looms, 250,000 workers, canals and railways converging like arteries to feed the insatiable appetite of the machines. This was the city that invented the modern economy, where capitalism took its brutal, transformative shape. How did this industrial miracle happen, and what was the true cost of clothing the world? Long before Manchester became synonymous with cotton and industry, the landscape was marked by something far more modest. A low sandstone bluff rose where the rivers Irwell and Medlock converged, offering natural protection and commanding views across the Cheshire Plain. It was here, around the year 79, that Roman soldiers established Mamucium, a fort designed to guard the road linking their northern strongholds of Chester and York. The Romans built in stone, constructing granaries, barracks, and a bathhouse within defensive walls. For 3 centuries, this outpost hummed with military life, housing auxiliary troops recruited from across the empire. But when the legions withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, Mamucium crumbled into ruins, its stones scavenged by locals for building material. The site returned to marshland and scrub. Medieval Manchester emerged slowly from these remnants. By the time of the Norman conquest, it was a small agricultural settlement clustered around a newly built church. The Domesday Book of 1086 recorded it tersely: a modest manor with a priest, a church, and a handful of woodland acres. Nothing suggested future greatness. The town's fortunes began shifting in the 13th century when it received its charter granting market rights. Every week, farmers and traders gathered in what is now Market Street, exchanging wool, grain, and livestock. This was Lancashire wool country, where Pennine shepherds raised hardy flocks on windswept hills. Local women spun this wool into thread in their cottages, while men wove it into rough cloth on wooden looms. The arrival of Flemish weavers in the 14th century brought crucial expertise. Fleeing political turmoil in the Low Countries, these skilled craftsmen settled throughout Lancashire, teaching English weavers more sophisticated techniques. Manchester's textile trade evolved beyond basic woolens into finer fabrics. By the 1600s, the town had developed a specialty in fustian, a cloth combining linen warp with cotton weft, imported expensively from the Levant. This was cottage industry in its purest form. A merchant would distribute raw materials to families scattered across surrounding villages. In dimly lit rooms, hand-operated spinning wheels whirred while wooden looms clacked rhythmically. Children carded wool, mothers spun thread, fathers wove cloth. The merchant collected finished pieces weekly, paying by the yard. By 1750, Manchester remained thoroughly pre-industrial. Its population barely reached 20,000 souls. Half-timbered buildings lined narrow, unpaved streets. The Irwell ran clean enough for salmon. On market days, the town bustled, but it was hardly different from dozens of other provincial centers dotting England. Yet something was stirring. Local merchants had accumulated capital from textile trading. Waterways provided transport. Coal deposits lay nearby. The cotton arriving through Liverpool ports was cheaper than linen. And in workshops and mines across Britain, inventors were beginning to ask a transformative question. Could machines do what human hands had always done? The old world was about to end. In 1759, a young aristocrat faced financial ruin. Francis Egerton, 3rd Duke of Bridgewater, owned vast coal seams beneath his estate at Worsley, 7 miles west of Manchester. The coal was there, black and abundant, but getting it to market was crippling his finances. Pack horses struggled along rutted roads, each animal carrying barely 200 pounds. The journey cost more than the coal itself was worth in Manchester's markets. The Duke, barely 23 years old, conceived an audacious solution. He would build an artificial river. This was no modest drainage ditch. The Duke envisioned a canal stretching from his mines directly into Manchester's heart, capable of carrying 40 tons of coal per barge. His steward dismissed it as fantasy. His family questioned his sanity. But Bridgewater had witnessed continental canals during his grand tour, and he possessed both aristocratic stubbornness and desperate need. He hired James Brindley, a millwright from Derbyshire with barely any formal education, but an uncanny genius for visualizing how water could be made to flow. Brindley had never built a canal. He could hardly write his own name. Yet when he walked the terrain between Worsley and Manchester, he saw what others missed: gradients, watersheds, the subtle contours that would guide his artificial river. Parliament granted approval in 1760. Construction began immediately. Workers dug into hillsides, creating underground channels that would flood the coal seams themselves, allowing barges to load directly within the mine. It was brilliantly efficient, but the real challenge lay ahead. Between Worsley and Manchester stood the River Irwell, flowing through a valley 40 feet below the proposed canal path. Traditional engineering called for locks descending to the river, crossing it, then ascending again. Brindley proposed something unprecedented. The canal would cross above the river. The Barton Aqueduct rose like a Roman monument reborn. Stone pillars supported a waterproof trough carrying the canal 39 feet above the Irwell. Skeptics predicted catastrophic collapse. Merchants wagered fortunes on failure. On July 17, 1761, boats laden with coal floated across thin air while vessels sailed beneath them on the river below. Manchester witnessed a miracle. The Duke's barges glided into Castlefield, unloading directly at new wharves. No roads, no pack horses, no weather delays. A single horse could now pull a barge carrying 50 times what it could haul in a cart. Coal prices collapsed overnight. What had cost 7 pence per hundredweight plummeted to 3 pence and 6 pence. Factories that had burned wood switched to coal. Homes heated more affordably. The economic impact rippled through every manufactory and workshop. The Duke had invested his entire fortune, borrowing heavily against future revenues. Within 5 years, he was recovering £25,000 annually. By 1776, when the canal reached the textile hub of Lee, it was generating immense wealth. Britain noticed. If an artificial waterway could transform Manchester's economy, what could a network of canals achieve? The Duke of Bridgewater had provided the template. From the Scottish lowlands to the Welsh borders, investors and engineers began plotting new routes, envisioning a nation knitted together by water. Manchester stood at the center of this vision, its wharves growing crowded with coal, limestone, and increasingly raw cotton arriving via Liverpool. The Bridgewater Canal had proven that geography could be conquered, that capital and engineering could reshape the landscape itself. The age of water had begun. But water alone would not build Manchester's future. For that, the town would need something far more revolutionary, machines that could spin and weave faster than human hands ever could. The machines hummed in a way Manchester had never heard before. In 1769, a barber-turned-inventor named Richard Arkwright secured a patent that would reshape human labor itself. His water frame did something no previous device could manage. It spun cotton threads strong enough for warp, the lengthwise threads that bore all the tension in cloth. Earlier inventions produced only weak weft thread. Arkwright's creation changed everything. But the machine was too large for cottage workshops, too powerful for human hands to turn. It needed water. Rushing water from rivers and streams, channeled through wheels that never tired, that worked through night and day without pause. In 1771, Arkwright partnered with wealthy hosiers in Cromford, Derbyshire, building his first mill beside the River Derwent. The building rose 5 stories high, its windows arranged in precise rows. Inside, dozens of water frames clattered in synchronized rhythm. Workers tended the machines, piecing broken threads, removing full bobbins, maintaining the mechanical orchestra. They did not spin thread themselves. The machines did that. The workers simply kept them running. This was factory discipline, and it was utterly foreign to traditional craftwork. Weavers and spinners had always controlled their own time, working in bursts when orders arrived, resting when they chose. The factory recognized no such freedom. The water wheel turned when water flowed. Machines operated on their schedule, not humanity's. Workers arrived at fixed hours, left at fixed hours, their days measured not by completed tasks, but by time served. Manchester manufacturers watched Cromford's success with hungry eyes. By 1780, Arkwright's patents were being tested in courts as competitors built their own water frames, modified just enough to claim innovation. Legal battles raged, but nothing could stop the spread. Cotton mills appeared along every suitable stream within 20 miles of Manchester. The Irwell, the Irk, the Medlock became lined with brick buildings, their wheels churning. The mills needed workers. Not skilled craftsmen commanding high wages, but operatives who could be trained in days. Women proved ideal for piecing threads with nimble fingers. Children even more so. Their small hands could reach into machinery, cleaning cotton waste from moving parts, crawling beneath frames to retrieve dropped bobbins. A child of 7 could earn 2 shillings weekly in the mills. For impoverished families, this was irresistible income. Parish workhouses in London and southern counties, desperate to reduce their burden, sent orphans north in wagons. Mill owners provided housing in apprentice houses, basic meals, minimal education on Sundays. In return, these children worked 13-hour shifts, 6 days weekly, surrounded by deafening noise and dangerous machinery. The transformation was staggering in its speed. In 1773, Manchester had perhaps 30,000 residents. By 1783, The population approached 42,000. By 1789, it surpassed 50,000. Workers flooded in from rural Lancashire, from Yorkshire, from Ireland. They came seeking wages, steady employment, escape from agricultural poverty. Housing could not keep pace. Medieval streets designed for market towns now choked with humanity. Builders threw up tenements with brutal efficiency, cramming families into single rooms, providing minimal sanitation, maximizing profit. Courts and alleys spawned in chaotic tangles behind main thoroughfares, creating labyrinths of poverty hidden from casual view. The cotton trade exploded. Raw cotton imports to Britain doubled between 1780 and 1785, then doubled again by 1790. Manchester's warehouses overflowed with American cotton arriving through Liverpool, transformed by water-powered mills into thread, woven into cloth, then exported across the globe. The town was becoming an engine of production unprecedented in human history. Yet something profound had shifted beyond mere economics. For millennia, manufacturing had been human-scaled, limited by the strength of arms, the steadiness of hands, the hours a person could work before exhaustion. Arkwright's mills had broken those limits. Machines worked faster than hands. Water provided power beyond muscle. Factories concentrated production with ruthless efficiency. Manchester had discovered the template for modern industry. Other towns still relied on traditional methods, but here, the future had arrived. And that future ran on coal-powered wheels, mechanical precision, and the water wheels that had liberated cotton production from human muscle now became shackles of a different kind. Mills clustered beside rivers, dependent on natural flow. During summer droughts, wheels slowed to a crawl. Winter ice brought production to complete standstill. Floods damaged machinery. Mill owners calculated lost profits and cursed their reliance on nature's whims. Then came James Watt's refinement of the steam engine. Earlier atmospheric engines had existed since 1712, crude beasts that consumed coal voraciously while delivering minimal power. Watt's separate condenser, patented in 1769, transformed efficiency. His partnership with Birmingham manufacturer Matthew Boulton created engines that could genuinely replace water wheels. The first Boulton and Watt engine arrived in Manchester in 1789, installed at Peter Drinkwater's mill on Shoot-Hill. The cotton masters gathered to watch it operate, mesmerized by steady rotary motion independent of rivers, weather, or season. Within months, orders flooded toward Birmingham. By 1795, over a dozen steam engines powered Manchester mills. The implications were revolutionary. Mills no longer needed riverside locations. Manufacturers could build anywhere coal could be delivered. And Manchester, connected to surrounding coal fields by improving turnpike roads, sat perfectly positioned. The city center itself became viable for factory construction. Mills erupted across Manchester's core with startling speed. Ancoats, previously open fields northeast of the medieval town, transformed into an industrial district within a decade. By 1800, over 50 mills operated in Manchester proper, their chimneys rising like a forest of brick. McConnell and Kennedy's mills on Ancoats Lane. Murray's mills on Jersey Street. Dozens more whose names filled directories, but whose scale defied description for those who had never witnessed industrial production. Each mill employed hundreds. the larger establishments, 1,000 or more. These were not the 5-story watermills of Arkwright's era, but towering structures of 7, 8, 9 floors, their facades dominated by repetitive windows that illuminated endless rows of spinning machines. The architectural historian might see beauty in their proportioned symmetry. The workers saw only walls containing their labor. American cotton arrived in quantities that would have seemed fantastical a generation earlier. Southern plantations, expanding across Georgia and the Carolinas on the backs of enslaved laborers, produced cotton in ever-increasing volume. Liverpool's docks received ships heavy with raw bales. Wagons hauled it to Manchester warehouses. By 1800, Britain imported over 56 million pounds of raw cotton annually. By 1810, that figure approached 128 million pounds. Manchester processed the majority. The population statistics reveal the human dimension of this industrial explosion. 50,000 residents in 1789 became 70,000 by 1800. By 1810, Manchester and its immediate satellite towns of Salford and Chorlton contained over 110,000 souls. Workers arrived weekly from dying rural industries, from Irish ports, from anywhere poverty drove people toward wage labor. The skyline announced Manchester's transformation to approaching travelers miles before they reached the town. Dozens upon dozens of factory chimneys belched coal smoke into Lancashire skies, creating a permanent haze that turned noon into twilight. The smoke carried the acrid taste of sulfur, the grit of particulate matter that settled on clothing, buildings, lungs. Visitors described Manchester as hell with the roof off. Yet for all its grim conditions, Manchester hummed with unprecedented energy. This was industry unshackled from geography, production freed from natural limits, capitalism operating at a scale and intensity never before achieved. The steam engine had done more than replace water wheels. It had announced that human ingenuity could transcend environmental constraints entirely. Manchester had become Cottonopolis, the first city where manufacturing defined existence completely. But the social consequences of concentrating tens of thousands of workers in factory districts, subjected to mechanical discipline and living in squalid housing, remained largely unconsidered. That reckoning would arrive with the new century. The workers who entered Manchester's mills each morning faced conditions that would have horrified their rural ancestors. The factory bell rang at 5:30, summoning hundreds from cramped lodgings. By 6 o'clock, every machine needed a human attendant. Latecomers faced fines, sometimes an hour's wages for arriving 5 minutes past the bell. Inside, the noise overwhelmed every sense. Thousands of spindles whirred simultaneously, creating a din that made conversation impossible. Workers communicated through gestures and lip reading. Many developed permanent hearing loss within years. The air hung thick with cotton fiber particles that coated lungs, causing the persistent hacking cough that doctors called brown lung. Windows remained closed regardless of season, as drafts disrupted the delicate spinning process. The machinery dictated human rhythm completely. Spinners could not pause when tired. Piecers, often children, scrambled beneath moving equipment to tie broken threads, their small fingers prized for dexterity in tight spaces. Accidents occurred with grim regularity. A moment's inattention near unguarded gears meant crushed fingers or worse. Factory records rarely acknowledged these incidents, treating maimed workers as simply replaceable. 14-hour days became standard. Some mills operated 16. Sunday offered the only respite, though exhausted workers often spent it recovering rather than enjoying leisure. This industrial tempo bore no relation to agricultural labor's seasonal variation. There were no harvests to complete, no winter slowdowns. The machines ran constantly, and humans served the machines. Children comprised nearly half the mill workforce by 1800. Some entered employment as young as 5 or 6 years old, though most started around age 8. Factory owners preferred children for tasks requiring nimble fingers and small bodies. They also accepted lower wages without complaint. Parish authorities shipped orphans from London workhouses to Manchester mills by the wagon load, providing manufacturers with captive labor that cost virtually nothing beyond minimal food and shelter. These child workers received no education beyond what the machines taught. They learned to tie threads, to clean cotton waste from gears, to work despite exhaustion. Many developed permanently stunted growth from malnutrition and premature labor. Spinal deformities resulted from hours spent bent over machines. Yet their wages often meant survival for entire families. The housing that sheltered this new working class matched the mills in wretchedness. Thousands inhabited cellars below street level, damp spaces with earthen floors where daylight never penetrated. A single room might hold an entire family or several families sharing space. Rent consumed over half of weekly earnings for these hovels. Sanitation remained primitive to non-existent. Streets lacked sewers. Human waste accumulated in courtyards and alleys, creating fetid pools that bred disease. Typhus swept regularly through working-class districts. Cholera would arrive soon. The average life expectancy in Manchester's poorest neighborhoods fell to just 25 years by 1810 compared to 40 in rural areas. Employers often paid wages through the truck system, providing credit at company-owned shops rather than cash. These shops charged inflated prices for inferior goods, trapping workers in perpetual debt. A family could labor for months yet never accumulate savings, the shopkeeper's ledger always showing amounts owed. Yet amid this misery, solidarity emerged. Workers formed friendly societies, pooling small weekly contributions to provide sickness benefits and funeral expenses. These organizations, meeting in public houses after shifts, created the first collective response to industrial capitalism's harshness. The societies remained small, local, focused on mutual aid rather than confrontation. But they represented something new, workers recognizing shared interest beyond individual survival. Manchester's machinery produced unprecedented wealth. But the human cost of that production, measured in broken bodies and shortened lives, had barely begun to register in public consciousness. Victory over Napoleon brought not celebration to Manchester but catastrophe. When the wars ended in 1815, government contracts for uniforms and supplies vanished overnight. Mills that had run at capacity suddenly sat half empty. Wages already meager plummeted by a third within months. Workers who had endured wartime privations hoping for post-war relief instead faced unemployment and hunger. The situation worsened dramatically when Parliament passed the Corn Laws in 1815. These statutes prohibited wheat imports until domestic prices reached artificially high levels, protecting wealthy landowners' profits while condemning the poor to bread they could scarcely afford. In Manchester, where nearly every penny went toward food, a 4-pound loaf that cost 8 pence before the war now cost 15. Families already spending 3/4 of their income on food simply went hungry. How does a society respond when its most basic compact, the promise that hard work brings sustenance, completely collapses? Manchester's workers had accepted brutal factory conditions, believing their labor earned survival. Now even survival seemed impossible. Desperation breeds radicalism. Some turned to machine breaking. The Luddite movement, which had begun in Nottingham during the war, spread to Lancashire's cotton districts. Bands of masked men smashed steam looms under cover of darkness, targeting the technology they blamed for unemployment. These were not mindless acts of vandalism but calculated industrial sabotage, attacks on specific machines whose owners had cut wages or dismissed workers. The government responded with overwhelming force, declaring machine breaking a capital offense and deploying 12,000 troops across the textile regions. Others sought change through politics, though hardly any working man could vote. The franchise belonged exclusively to substantial property owners, a requirement that disqualified 95% of Manchester's male population. The city, despite housing over 100,000 people, sent no representatives to Parliament whatsoever. Nearby villages with barely a dozen residents returned 2 members each. This absurdity of representation infuriated those who created the nation's wealth yet possessed no political voice. Into this volatile atmosphere stepped radical reformers advocating universal male suffrage. They held public meetings in increasing numbers, drawing crowds that alarmed local magistrates. The speakers demanded the vote, annual parliaments, and the secret ballot. Revolutionary language? Perhaps. But these men articulated grievances that resonated with thousands who saw no peaceful remedy to their suffering. Henry Hunt emerged as the movement's most charismatic voice. This gentleman farmer turned radical orator possessed unusual gifts, commanding crowds of 10,000 or more with speeches that mixed constitutional arguments with passionate denunciations of aristocratic privilege. Hunt advocated strictly peaceful methods, believing moral force and public pressure could compel Parliament toward reform. His followers called him Orator Hunt. Authorities called him a dangerous demagogue. By 1819, Manchester's radical reformers planned their largest demonstration yet. They would gather at St. Peter's Field, a vast open space near the city center, to hear Hunt demand parliamentary reform. Organizers anticipated 40,000 attendees. They drilled participants in peaceful assembly techniques, instructing families to attend together, bringing children to demonstrate their respectability. The authorities watched these preparations with mounting alarm. Magistrates requested military support. Troops assembled in nearby barracks. The stage was set for a confrontation. Manchester, engine of British prosperity, had become a powder keg. All that remained was the spark. Monday morning, August 16, 1819, dawned bright and clear over Manchester. From surrounding towns and villages, columns of working people began their march towards St. Peter's Field. They came from Middleton and Rochdale, from Oldham and Stockport, walking in orderly formations behind homemade banners proclaiming universal suffrage and equal representation. Women wore their Sunday finest, white dresses symbolizing purity of purpose. Men carried their children on their shoulders. This was to be a display of respectability, a demonstration that working people deserved the vote precisely because they could assemble peacefully and rationally demand it. By 11 o'clock, The field held not the anticipated 40,000 but closer to 60,000 souls. They packed the open space between rows of houses, a sea of humanity larger than any gathering Manchester had ever witnessed. The mood felt almost festive. Vendors sold gingerbread. People sang hymns. When Henry Hunt's carriage finally arrived at 1:30, the crowd erupted in cheers that echoed across the city center. Hunt climbed onto the hastily constructed platform and raised his hands for silence. He had barely spoken his opening words when everything shattered. The Manchester and Salford yeomanry received their orders. These were not professional soldiers, but local businessmen and shopkeepers playing at cavalry, many of them drunk, all of them hostile to the reform movement that threatened their interests. 60 horsemen drew their sabers and spurred their mounts directly into the densest part of the crowd. What happened next unfolded with horrifying speed. The cavalry did not disperse the gathering, but attacked it. Sabers slashed downward at unprotected heads. Horses trampled those who fell. People screamed and ran, but with 60,000 packed tightly together, there was nowhere to go. Panic spread like wildfire. The crowd surged away from the cavalry, crushing those at the edges against buildings and walls. The yeomanry reached the platform and arrested Hunt, but rather than withdrawing, they continued hacking at the crowd. Regular cavalry units, the 15th Hussars, then charged in supposedly to rescue their amateur counterparts. Professional soldiers trained for European battlefields now rode down English citizens carrying nothing more dangerous than banners. Within 15 minutes, St. Peter's Field transformed from peaceful assembly to massacre site. Bodies lay scattered across the trampled ground. Blood soaked into the earth. 11 people died that day or in the days following from their injuries, including a 2-year-old child crushed in the panic. 400 more suffered serious wounds from sabers or trampling. Many bore distinctive marks, cuts to their heads and shoulders from cavalry swords. These were not accidental injuries from crowd control gone wrong. These were deliberate strikes. The authorities initially celebrated. Magistrates congratulated the cavalry on their decisive action. The government sent official thanks. They had broken up an illegal assembly, they claimed, prevented revolution, maintained order. They could not have been more catastrophically wrong about the public reaction. News of what newspapers immediately christened Peterloo, a bitter parody of Waterloo, spread across Britain like a shockwave. Here was the government that had defeated Napoleon now turning its cavalry against unarmed citizens demanding the vote. Political moderates who had ignored calls for reform suddenly recognized the system's moral bankruptcy. Even conservative newspapers struggled to justify attacking women and children. In Manchester itself, a young merchant named John Edward Taylor witnessed the massacre and its aftermath. Outraged by both the violence and the local press's attempts to justify it, he gathered like-minded liberals to establish a new newspaper dedicated to truth and reform. On May 5, 1821, the Manchester Guardian published its first edition. Its founding principle, forged in the blood spilled at St. Peter's Field, declared that fair reporting and reasoned argument could achieve what violence never could. The newspaper would outlive the century, the monarchy it occasionally criticized, and the British Empire itself. Peterloo did not bring immediate reform. Parliament would not expand voting rights for another 13 years. but the massacre had torn away any pretense that the existing system deserved loyalty or respect. The question facing Britain was no longer whether change would come, but how much blood would be spilled before it arrived. The Manchester Guardian's first editor, John Edward Taylor, could not have imagined that within a decade, his city would pioneer a technology that would transform human civilization as profoundly as the printing press. While reformers still fought for political rights through newspapers and protests, engineers pursued a quieter revolution, one measured in coal consumption and miles of iron rail. George Stephenson had spent years perfecting the steam locomotive at collieries across northern England. These were industrial beasts, designed to haul coal wagons at walking speed over short distances. But Stephenson envisioned something far more ambitious. What if locomotives could carry people? What if they could match the speed of stagecoaches? What if railways could link Britain's great cities, moving goods and passengers faster than any horse could manage? Liverpool's merchants needed Manchester's manufactured goods. Manchester's mill owners needed Liverpool's raw cotton and access to global markets. The 35 miles between them saw constant traffic of horse-drawn wagons laboring along rutted roads and barges crawling through canal locks. The journey took 2 days in good weather, longer when rain turned roads to mud. Stephenson proposed completing it in 2 hours. Skeptics ridiculed the scheme. Locomotives would terrify livestock and kill passengers with their unnatural speeds. The smoke would suffocate travelers. Rain would make iron rails too slippery. Birds flying alongside the trains would be sucked into the carriages through open windows. Medical authorities solemnly warned that human bodies could not withstand traveling faster than 20 miles per hour without suffering permanent damage. Parliament authorized construction in 1826 anyway. Investors gambled fortunes on Stephenson's vision. Workers carved cuttings through solid rock, built viaducts across valleys, and constructed a floating track bed across the treacherous Chat Moss Bog, where previous surveyors had deemed railway construction impossible. The engineering challenges matched anything attempted during canal construction decades earlier, but now steam-powered machinery accelerated the work that had once required only human muscle and gunpowder. September 15, 1830 arrived with perfect autumn weather. The Duke of Wellington, now Prime Minister, would inaugurate the railway alongside dozens of dignitaries, members of Parliament, and foreign ambassadors. 8 locomotives pulled carriages filled with the wealthy and powerful. Brass bands played. Crowds lined the route, witnessing humanity's future thundering past at the impossible speed of 30 miles per hour. At Parkside, 17 miles from Liverpool, the train stopped for water. Passengers disembarked to stretch their legs despite warnings to remain in carriages. William Huskisson, former cabinet minister and Liverpool's Member of Parliament, crossed the tracks to speak with Wellington. The two men had been political rivals, but were attempting reconciliation. Huskisson heard shouts. Stephenson's rocket was approaching on the adjacent track. He panicked, tried to climb back into Wellington's carriage, grasped the door but lost his grip. The door swung outward, pushing him directly into the locomotive's path. The rocket's wheels crushed his leg. They rushed Huskisson toward Manchester on the rocket itself, Stephenson driving his engine at speeds approaching 36 miles per hour in a desperate race against death. It made no difference. Huskisson died that evening, becoming railway transportation's first celebrity fatality. The celebration turned to mourning. Wellington's carriage continued to Manchester, where hostile crowds jeered the Prime Minister who had opposed electoral reform. The day that should have announced Britain's technological supremacy instead demonstrated progress's price. Yet, the railway succeeded beyond even Stephenson's optimism. Within months, it carried hundreds of thousands of passengers annually. Journey times collapsed. Freight costs plummeted. Manchester's manufacturers could ship goods to Liverpool's docks faster and cheaper than ever imagined. Other cities demanded their own railways. The Iron Horse had proven itself, and Britain's landscape would never look the same. By 1840, Manchester had become the most discussed city in Europe, but visitors arrived expecting wonder and left with something closer to horror. The industrial future they had traveled to witness was undeniably powerful, undeniably profitable, and undeniably appalling. Alexis de Tocqueville arrived from France that summer, fresh from analyzing American democracy. Nothing in his travels had prepared him for Manchester. From this foul drain, he wrote, "The greatest stream of human industry flows out to fertilize the whole world. From this filthy sewer pure gold flows. Here humanity attains its most complete development and its most brutish." The contradictions overwhelmed visiting intellectuals and reformers. Manchester's warehouses overflowed with the finest cotton cloth on earth. Its merchants commanded global trade networks. Its machinery represented humanity's most sophisticated engineering. Yet the workers who created this wealth lived in conditions that shocked observers from even Europe's poorest regions. Little Ireland, the district that housed Irish immigrants fleeing famine in their homeland, exemplified the city's darker reality. Built in a depression near the River Medlock, it consisted of back-to-back cottages jammed together without ventilation, proper drainage, or clean water. Families of 8 or 10 shared single rooms. Courts and alleyways flooded with sewage during heavy rain. The stench, witnesses reported, could be detected half a mile away on favorable winds. Friedrich Engels, a young German sent to Manchester by his father to learn the family's cotton business, instead learned about capitalism's human costs. He walked through Little Ireland and dozens of similar slums, documenting conditions in notebooks that would later form his work, The Condition of the Working Class in England. He found cellars where families lived below ground in perpetual dampness, their children pale as mushrooms. He recorded mortality statistics that revealed working-class infants died at triple the rate of middle-class babies. Disease thrived in such conditions. Cholera, the century's most terrifying epidemic illness, swept through Manchester in 1832 and returned in 1849. The disease struck with horrifying speed, turning healthy adults into corpses within hours through violent purging. Victims' skin turned blue from dehydration. Entire families died within days. Medical authorities initially blamed the disease on miasma, bad air rising from filth. They were partly correct about the filth, entirely wrong about the mechanism. Cholera spread through contaminated water, and Manchester's poor drank from wells and standpipes that mixed freely with sewage. The disease recognized no class boundaries in theory, but in practice it slaughtered those who could not afford clean water while largely sparing the wealthy in their suburban villas. Charles Dickens visited repeatedly throughout the 1840s, gathering material that would emerge in his novel Hard Times. He christened his fictional industrial city Coketown, but everyone recognized Manchester. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, he wrote, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves forever and ever, and never got uncoiled. Political economists and social reformers now studied Manchester as physicians studied disease. If this was capitalism's future, what did that mean for civilization? The city had become an accidental laboratory, an experiment in unfettered industrial development that no one had consciously designed but everyone had to confront. The mills ran 24 hours, their windows blazing through the night. Smoke from 10,000 chimneys merged into a permanent canopy that turned noon to twilight. And through the chemical fog walked nearly 300,000 souls, building the modern world while wondering if they would survive to see it. Friedrich Engels was 22 years old when he stepped off the train in Manchester in November 1842, sent by his father to manage operations at the family's cotton spinning firm, Ehrman and Engels. The elder Engels hoped the posting would cure his son's radical tendencies and prepare him for respectable business life. Instead, Manchester would transform the young German into one of history's most influential revolutionary thinkers. Unlike the genteel visitors who toured model factories and dined with cotton lords, Engels ventured where few middle-class observers dared. His guide into this hidden Manchester was Mary Burns, a fiery Irish working woman he met within months of his arrival. Burns worked in the mills and lived in the slums. Through her, Engels gained access to a city within the city, a parallel world invisible to the manufacturers who profited from it. Burns led Engels through districts no Turing intellectual had properly documented. They walked the courts of Ancoats at dawn when workers stumbled toward the mills in darkness. They visited cellars in Deansgate where entire families slept on piles of rags, the walls running with condensation and worse. She introduced him to workers who would speak candidly about their wages, their injuries, their children's deaths from fever and malnutrition. Engels began systematically documenting what he witnessed. He collected mortality statistics from parish records. He interviewed doctors who treated workers' occupational diseases. He traced the path of industrial waste from factories into the rivers where the poor drew drinking water. His notebooks filled with damning facts and figures that would have shocked his father's business associates had they known what the young heir was researching after his shifts at the firm. By day, Engels managed the cotton works on Weast Lane in Salford, learning the mechanics of an industry built on exploitation. By night, he wrote furiously in his lodgings, transforming observations into analysis. He was developing a theory that the poverty surrounding him was not an unfortunate accident of industrialization, but its inevitable product. Capitalism required a desperate working class to function. Manchester's slums were not failures of the system, but proof that the system was working exactly as designed. His manuscript, The Condition of the Working Class in England, appeared in German in 1845. The book combined Engels' meticulous documentation with passionate moral outrage. He described workers' housing in clinical detail, then asked readers to imagine raising children in such conditions. He presented factory accident statistics, then named the owners who prioritized profits over safety guards on dangerous machinery. The sections on child labor were particularly devastating. Engels described children as young as 5 working 13-hour shifts in cotton mills, their growth stunted, their bodies deformed by repetitive motions. He documented how factory discipline required overseers to beat children to keep them awake at their stations. These were not isolated abuses but standard practice in Manchester's most respectable firms. What made Engels' work revolutionary was not merely its documentation, but its analysis. He argued that conflict between workers and owners was not a moral failing on either side, but a structural feature of industrial capitalism. The system required ever-increasing profits, which demanded ever lower wages and worse conditions. This logic would inevitably drive workers toward collective action and, ultimately, revolution. In 1844, Engels met Karl Marx in Paris. The two young radicals discovered an immediate intellectual kinship. Engels shared his Manchester research with Marx, providing empirical foundation for Marx's philosophical critique of capitalism. The partnership that would produce the Communist Manifesto had begun, and Manchester's smoking chimneys would haunt every page. By 1848, as revolutions erupted across Europe, Engels and Marx published their manifesto calling for workers of the world to unite. The opening sentence might as well have been written from a Manchester rooftop overlooking the mills. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. That specter had first taken solid form in the world's first industrial city, observed by a German businessman's son who chose Mary Burns' truth over his father's profits. While Engels documented Manchester's poverty, another movement was forming in the city's counting houses and merchants' clubs, one that would achieve political victory where revolutionary theory could not. The industrialists who had created modern Manchester now wanted to reshape Britain's entire economic system to serve their interests. Their weapon would not be class warfare, but the price of bread. The Corn Laws had protected British landowners since 1815 by imposing tariffs on imported grain. This kept bread expensive, enriching aristocratic estates while forcing workers to spend most of their wages on food. For Manchester's factory owners, this was doubly infuriating. High food costs meant they had to pay higher wages. Meanwhile, European nations retaliated against British grain tariffs by taxing British manufactured goods, strangling export markets that Manchester's mills desperately needed. In 1838, 7 Manchester businessmen gathered at the York Hotel to found the Anti-Corn Law League. Richard Cobden, a calico printer who had built a fortune through shrewd business sense and international trade connections, emerged as the movement's intellectual leader. John Bright, a Rochdale mill owner known for his powerful oratory, became its passionate voice. Together, they transformed a local merchant's grievance into a national crusade that would be remembered as the first modern political campaign. The League established its headquarters on Newall's Buildings in Market Street, transforming it into a factory for political agitation. They employed hundreds of clerks to maintain voter lists, print pamphlets, and coordinate speakers across Britain. The organization spent over £100,000 in 1 year alone, an unprecedented sum that dwarfed traditional political expenditures. This was business efficiency applied to politics, Manchester's industrial methods weaponized for ideological warfare. Cobden and Bright crisscrossed Britain, speaking to audiences in town halls, theaters, and open fields. Bright's speeches combined moral passion with economic logic. He painted vivid pictures of workers' children crying from hunger while landowners grew rich from artificial scarcity. Was it not theft, he thundered, to tax the bread that fed the poor? Did not every natural law of commerce demand that goods flow freely to where they were needed most? But the League's genius lay not in emotion, but in organization. They distributed 5 million tracts in a single year. They registered thousands of sympathizers as voters in key constituencies. They funded sympathetic candidates in parliamentary elections. When traditional venues banned their rallies, They constructed their own meeting hall on Peter Street, grandly naming it the Free Trade Hall. The building opened in 1843, its very existence a statement that Manchester's commercial class had arrived as a permanent political force. The League framed their cause not as merchant self-interest but as universal principle. Free trade was presented as natural law, as inevitable as gravity, as moral as abolition. Protection was painted as aristocratic privilege strangling Britain's natural commercial genius. This rhetoric transformed a debate about tariff rates into an existential struggle between the future and the past. Prime Minister Robert Peel, though a conservative elected to defend agricultural interests, understood which way history was moving. When the Irish potato famine created humanitarian crisis in 1845, Peel seized his moment. In 1846, Parliament repealed the Corn Laws, ending centuries of agricultural protection. The vote split the Conservative Party, but remade British economic policy. Manchester's merchants had won. More importantly, they had established a template: detailed organization, relentless propaganda, and the framing of commercial interests as moral imperatives. The city that had invented industrial capitalism had now pioneered modern political campaigning. And the ideas they championed, free trade and market competition over aristocratic privilege, would spread from Manchester across the globe as the defining economic philosophy of the age to come. By 1850, Manchester had transformed from revolutionary crucible into something far more powerful: the undisputed center of the global textile trade. The city's 250 cotton mills operated with mechanical precision, their 40,000 looms weaving raw fiber into finished cloth at speeds that would have seemed miraculous just decades earlier. From this concentrated square mile of smoking chimneys flowed fabric that clothed workers in Australia, merchants in Argentina, soldiers in India, and slaves laboring in fields that supplied the very cotton being processed. Manchester was no longer just a city. It was an empire unto itself. The Royal Exchange stood as the physical embodiment of this commercial dominance. Rebuilt in 1849 at the staggering cost of £100,000, its trading floor stretched beneath a glass and iron dome where over 7,000 merchants and brokers gathered daily. Here, deals were struck with a handshake that moved cotton worth millions across oceans. At precisely 12:15 each afternoon, the floor erupted into controlled chaos as traders shouted orders, settled accounts, and negotiated shipments to every corner of the earth. A merchant could arrive with raw cotton from Mississippi and leave with orders for finished calico bound for Calcutta, all executed in minutes. This was capitalism operating at maximum velocity. The numbers told a story of unprecedented concentration. Manchester and its satellite towns produced 1/4 of all British exports. 800 million pounds of cotton passed through the city's warehouses annually, feeding an industry that employed 400,000 workers in Lancashire alone. The city's merchants controlled markets from Shanghai to Sao Paulo, dictating prices and setting standards that the entire world followed. When Manchester sneezed, mills from Bombay to Barcelona caught cold. Yet this empire rested on a foundation that increasingly troubled even Manchester's hardest merchants: American slave labor. Nearly 70% of Britain's cotton imports came from the southern United States, where 4 million enslaved people toiled in fields producing the fiber that kept Manchester's looms running. The city's anti-slavery sentiment, genuine and long-standing, collided daily with economic reality. How could Manchester clothe the world while depending on bondage? The question hung uneasily over the exchange's trading floor. where fortunes built on slavery money changed hands beneath noble classical columns. The mills themselves became monuments to industrial ambition. Mill owners commissioned architects to design factories that combined ruthless efficiency with architectural grandeur. Italianate towers rose above engine houses. Ornate brickwork decorated facades facing streets thick with coal smoke. These buildings announced that cotton spinning was not merely commerce but civilization itself, progress made visible in brick and iron. Inside, thousands of workers tended machines in temperatures that reached 100 degrees, the humid heat necessary to keep cotton threads from snapping. The contrast between external grandeur and internal conditions revealed the essential contradiction of Manchester's golden age. The city's merchant princes grew wealthy beyond previous British imagination. Fortunes that once took aristocratic families generations to accumulate could now be amassed in years through shrewd cotton speculation and efficient mill management. They built vast estates in Cheshire, sent sons to Oxford and Cambridge, married daughters into old county families. Manchester's commercial elite was transforming itself into something resembling gentry, proving that industrial capital could purchase the social status that ancient lineage once monopolized. But even at its zenith, Manchester's cotton empire carried seeds of vulnerability. Complete dependence on American supply created dangerous exposure. What would happen if that supply were interrupted? The question seemed theoretical in 1850, when Southern plantations expanded yearly and British demand grew endlessly. Within a decade, that theoretical question would become catastrophic reality. The news reached Manchester in January 1862, delivered through telegraph wires that connected the city to Liverpool's docks. The American Civil War, which had erupted 9 months earlier, was tightening into total conflict. Union warships now blockaded southern ports, strangling the cotton trade at its source. Within weeks, the flow of raw fiber that had seemed as inevitable as the tides simply stopped. Manchester's warehouses, once mountains of white bales stacked 3 stories high, emptied with terrifying speed. By spring, the greatest industrial machine ever constructed began grinding to a halt. The collapse came in waves. Mills reduced shifts from 6 days to 4, then 4 to 3. By summer, entire factories stood silent, their boilers cold, their thousands of spindles motionless. Workers who had never missed a day found themselves queuing outside locked gates each morning, hoping for word of reopening that never came. The unemployment figures climbed with sickening inevitability. 50,000 by August, 100,000 by October, 250,000 across Lancashire by Christmas. Entire districts descended into destitution. Families pawned wedding rings, furniture, tools, anything that might buy another week of bread. Soup kitchens opened in churches and town halls, distributing thin gruel to lines that stretched for blocks. Ancoats, Ardwick, Miles Platting. These working-class neighborhoods became landscapes of quiet desperation. Children developed the swollen bellies of malnutrition. Women fainted in queues from weakness. Men sat in empty homes, unable to work yet too proud to beg, watching their families slowly starve. The poor law system, designed for manageable poverty, buckled under the weight of mass unemployment. Relief payments, barely sufficient in normal times, became impossible to sustain. Private charity filled some gaps, but compassion could not replace the wages that had vanished. Yet something remarkable emerged from this suffering. Confederate agents arrived in Manchester with a proposition: accept cotton from southern ports, help break the Union blockade, and the mills would run again. They held meetings, published pamphlets, promised prosperity if Lancashire would simply look away from slavery. The city's workers, hollow-cheeked and desperate, gave their answer at a packed meeting at the Free Trade Hall on December 31st, 1862. Despite their suffering, despite their children's hunger, they voted to support President Lincoln's cause and the abolition of slavery. They would starve before profiting from bondage. Lincoln received word of Manchester's resolution in the bitter winter of 1863. Amid military setbacks and political opposition, this gesture from workers across the Atlantic moved him deeply. He drafted a personal letter to the working people of Manchester, acknowledging their sacrifice and praising their moral courage. The letter, read at public meetings throughout the city, became a treasured document, proof that Manchester's suffering had meaning beyond simple economic catastrophe. Meanwhile, merchants scrambled for alternatives. Ships ventured to Egypt, India, Brazil, anywhere that grew cotton. Egyptian fiber began arriving in increasing quantities, though its shorter staple made it harder to process. Indian cotton, long considered inferior, filled some of the gap. Mill engineers redesigned machinery to handle these different varieties. Slowly, partially, the wheels began turning again. By 1864, perhaps half of Lancashire's workforce had returned to the looms, processing cotton from new sources. The famine ended in 1865 with Confederate surrender and the reopening of southern ports. But Manchester had changed. The city had discovered that its empire, seemingly invincible just years before, rested on foundations that could vanish overnight. The cotton mills started running again, but the Manchester that emerged from the famine bore little resemblance to the chaotic industrial frontier it had been. The crisis had exposed fundamental failures: inadequate sanitation, non-existent public services, slum housing that bred disease and despair. A new generation of civic leaders, many of them self-made industrialists who remembered the hungry years, determined that Manchester would transform itself from cautionary tale into model city. The change began with water. For decades, Manchester had drawn drinking water from the polluted Irwell and Medlock rivers, spreading cholera and typhoid through crowded neighborhoods. In 1870, the city completed the Longdendale reservoirs in the Pennine Hills, bringing clean mountain water through 66 miles of aqueduct. Deaths from waterborne disease dropped by half within 5 years. Gasworks expanded under municipal control, bringing streetlights to working-class districts previously left in darkness. The city was learning that public health required public investment. Yet, the most visible symbol of Manchester's ambition rose slowly on Albert Square. Alfred Waterhouse's Town Hall, begun in 1868, took 9 years to complete. The building announced Manchester's arrival as a great city through Gothic towers and elaborate stonework that rivaled Parliament itself. When Queen Victoria opened it in September 1877, 20,000 people lined the streets. The interior featured murals celebrating Manchester's history, from Roman fort to industrial capital, a deliberate mythology for a city barely a century old. Around the town hall, a new district emerged that spoke to Manchester's commercial dominance. The warehouse quarters spread across streets near Piccadilly, where merchants built ornate storage palaces for cotton, cloth, and finished goods. These were not mere sheds but architectural statements, S and J. Watts' warehouse featured terracotta facades copied from Italian palazzos, while Lancaster House boasted elaborate ironwork and massive loading bays. By 1880, Manchester's warehouses held goods worth millions of pounds, physical proof of the city's position as the world's trading hub for textiles. The reform movement reached even working neighborhoods. John Bright and the Free Libraries movement convinced the city to open reading rooms where workers could educate themselves without charge. The first opened in 1872 on Campfield, offering newspapers, books, and evening classes. Within a decade, branch libraries dotted the city. Education, reformers argued, would prevent future generations from experiencing the helplessness their parents had endured during the famine. Manchester in 1890 bore only superficial resemblance to the smoke-choked shock city of mid-century. Clean water flowed through taps. Gaslights illuminated streets. Grand public buildings proclaimed civic pride. Workers could read in free libraries. Yet the warehouses and mills still dominated the skyline, still defined the city's purpose. Manchester remained fundamentally a place of work, of trade, of making and moving goods. The reforms had made it healthier and more livable, but the question looming as the century neared its end was whether industrial supremacy itself could last forever. The reformers had made Manchester healthier, but they could not make it richer. By 1882, a bitter reality confronted the city's merchants. Liverpool was strangling their profits. Every bale of cotton, every bolt of finished cloth moving through Manchester paid tribute to Liverpool's docks, 36 miles west. The port charged handling fees, storage costs, and dock dues that added substantial expense to goods already transported hundreds of miles. Manchester produced the wealth, but Liverpool extracted the rent. Daniel Adamson, an engineer who had built boilers for steamships, called a meeting at his Didsbury home in June 1882. 65 merchants and manufacturers gathered in his drawing room to hear a radical proposition: build a canal large enough for ocean-going ships directly to Manchester, bypassing Liverpool entirely. The room erupted in debate. Critics called it impossible, financially ruinous, an engineering fantasy. Supporters saw liberation from Liverpool's monopoly. The Manchester Ship Canal Company formed within months, proposing the most ambitious waterway ever attempted in Britain. The canal would run 36 miles from the Mersey estuary to Manchester, wide enough and deep enough for 4,000-ton vessels. It would require moving 54 million cubic yards of earth, building 5 massive locks, and rerouting rivers. Engineers estimated costs at £5 million, an astronomical sum. Liverpool fought back with fury. Their port interests lobbied Parliament, spread rumors of financial collapse, warned that Manchester's scheme would bankrupt investors and destroy the region's economy. But Manchester's industrialists, tired of paying Liverpool's tribute, pushed harder. After bitter parliamentary debates, royal assent came in August 1885. Manchester would have its canal. Construction began in November 1887 with ceremony and speeches, but the reality proved more brutal than anyone anticipated. 16,000 navvies descended on the route, digging through clay and rock with picks and shovels. Steam excavators, the largest machines Britain had yet built, carved channels through farmland and villages. Accidents killed dozens, floods washed away months of work, and money ran short before the canal reached halfway. In 1891, with funds exhausted and creditors circling, Manchester Corporation itself took over, pouring ratepayers' money into the half-finished waterway. The work continued through winter freezes and summer heat. Entire communities relocated as the canal consumed their land. Railways built temporary tracks to haul spoil. The Mersey and Irwell rivers were diverted into new channels. What had been fields and farms became the largest construction site Europe had seen, a trench wide enough for ocean vessels stretching toward Manchester's heart. Finally, on January 1st, 1894, water filled the completed canal for the first time. Test vessels navigated the lock successfully. On May 21st, Queen Victoria herself performed the opening ceremony, though she remained aboard the royal yacht rather than venturing into industrial Manchester. Ships from Hamburg, Rotterdam, and New York entered the city within weeks, their captains navigating inland through locks that lifted them 60 feet above sea level. The immediate impact transformed Trafford Park, 1,500 acres of estate land along the canal's banks. Industrialists recognized the opportunity. Flat land adjacent to deep water, connected to railways, minutes from Manchester's mills and warehouses. Within months, Trafford Park began its conversion into Britain's first planned industrial estate, where factories would rise beside their own private docks. Manchester had achieved what critics called impossible. The city now possessed an ocean port, 36 miles inland, free from Liverpool's control. But building the canal had consumed 8 years, cost £8 million, and buried the city in debt. Whether the gamble would pay off remained to be seen. While Manchester's merchants celebrated their new waterway, a revolution of a different magnitude was unfolding in a laboratory on Oxford Road. In 1907, Ernest Rutherford arrived at Manchester University from McGill in Canada, already famous for his work on radioactivity. The bearded New Zealander brought infectious energy to the physics department, along with an ambition that matched the city's industrial spirit. He intended to crack open the atom itself. Manchester proved the perfect setting for such audacity. The university had money from textile fortunes, equipment from precision engineering firms, and a culture that respected practical results over theoretical elegance. Rutherford assembled a team of young researchers in the cramped basement laboratories, including Hans Geiger, who would develop his famous radiation counter there. They worked in rooms that shook when trams passed outside, using apparatus machined in workshops that normally produced cotton mill components. The breakthrough came in 1911 through an experiment elegant in its simplicity. Rutherford's team fired alpha particles, tiny bullets of radioactive material at gold foil thinner than paper. Most particles passed straight through, as expected. But occasionally, one particle bounced backward, deflected by something dense at the gold's core. Rutherford later recalled his astonishment. It was as if you fired a 15-inch shell at tissue paper and it came back and hit you. That discovery overturned everything physicists believed about atomic structure. Matter was not a uniform pudding of particles, as the prevailing theory suggested. Instead, atoms possessed a tiny, dense nucleus at their center, surrounded mostly by empty space. The implications rippled through physics worldwide. Rutherford had revealed the architecture of reality itself, and he had done it in Manchester, using techniques that owed as much to the city's engineering precision as to pure science. By 1919, his team had identified the proton, the positively charged particle within that nucleus. Manchester University stood alongside Cambridge and Continental institutions as a center of fundamental physics research. Students and researchers came from across the world to work in those basement laboratories where the atom's secrets were being revealed. But while Rutherford peered into the infinitesimally small, Manchester's industries were scaling up for total war. When conflict erupted in 1914, the city's factories pivoted with remarkable speed. Cotton mills converted production lines to military uniforms and medical supplies. Engineering works that had built textile machinery now manufactured artillery shells and gun components. Chemical plants developed explosives and poison gas compounds, their expertise in industrial chemistry suddenly crucial to national survival. The Trafford Park Industrial Estate, barely 20 years old, became Britain's largest producer of war materials. Factories that had planned to serve global commerce instead served the Western Front. Women flooded into these plants by the thousands, operating machinery that had been exclusively male territory, filling shells with high explosives in dangerous conditions that killed dozens in accidental detonations. Metropolitan Vickers, established in Trafford Park in 1902, expanded rapidly to manufacture electrical equipment for warships and military installations. The company's workforce swelled to 10,000, working round-the-clock shifts to meet Admiralty demands. Manchester's precision engineering, developed through decades of cotton mill innovation, translated perfectly to military production. By November 1918, when armistice finally came, Manchester's dual identity stood clear: a city that could split atoms and forge artillery, advance theoretical physics, and mass-produce munitions. The war had killed thousands of Manchester men in Flanders mud, but it had also proven the city's industrial versatility. Peace would bring new challenges, new markets, and the question of whether Manchester's factories could transition back to civilian production as smoothly as they had converted to war. The peace dividend Manchester anticipated never materialized. Instead, the 1920s brought a reckoning that would hollow out the city's economic heart. Indian mills, equipped with modern machinery and paying workers a fraction of Lancashire wages, began flooding global markets with cheap cotton goods. Japan joined the assault, its textile industry protected by tariffs, while British exports faced mounting barriers. The empire that had supplied raw cotton and bought finished cloth was learning to compete, and Manchester was losing. The statistics told a brutal story. Cotton exports, which had stood at 7 billion yards in 1913, collapsed to under 4 billion by 1930. Mill after mill faced the same arithmetic. Indian cloth cost 40% less to produce, Japanese goods even cheaper. Manchester's merchants, who had once dictated terms to the world, now watched helplessly as orders dried up and warehouses filled with unsold fabric. Unemployment struck the city like a plague. By 1931, 1 in 4 workers had no job. In some textile districts, the figure reached 40%. Men who had spent lifetimes tending looms gathered on street corners with nothing to do, their skills suddenly worthless. Women who had worked since childhood found mill gates locked, production lines silent. Families that had known steady wages for generations discovered what hunger actually meant. The human cost manifested in statistics that shocked even hardened social reformers. Infant mortality in working-class districts remained stubbornly high. Rickets, that disease of malnutrition and sunlight deprivation, twisted children's bones in slums where families crowded 6 to a room. Tuberculosis thrived in damp tenements where ventilation meant cracks and crumbling walls. Health visitors reported conditions that differed little from Victorian squalor. The city council, finally confronting decades of neglect, launched slum clearance programs that would reshape Manchester's residential landscape. Entire streets of back-to-back housing, those monuments to industrial-era overcrowding, came down under demolition crews. In their place rose council estates with revolutionary features: indoor plumbing, separate bedrooms, gardens. Wythenshawe, planned as a garden suburb in the city's south, promised fresh air and green spaces for families escaping inner-city decay. But demolishing slums could not rebuild an economy. Manchester struggled desperately to diversify beyond cotton's collapsing empire. Engineering firms sought contracts in electrical equipment and vehicle manufacturing. Chemical plants experimented with new synthetic materials. Trafford Park's factories pivoted toward consumer goods, producing everything from radios to refrigerators for Britain's emerging middle class. These new industries employed thousands, but not the tens of thousands that cotton had sustained. The mills themselves became monuments to obsolescence, their empty windows staring over streets where unemployment queues stretched around corners. Some owners simply walked away, leaving machinery to rust and buildings to decay. Others clung on, running reduced shifts and praying for recovery that never came. As the 1930s progressed and Europe's political temperature rose, Manchester faced an uncomfortable truth. The city that had clothed the world could barely clothe itself. The cotton trade that had built this metropolis was dying, and nothing emerging could replace its scale or significance. The sirens began wailing across Manchester at 7:30 on the evening of December 22, 1940. Christmas shoppers still crowded Market Street, carrying parcels wrapped in brown paper, when the first wave of German bombers appeared over the Pennines. For 272 civilians, this would be their last night alive. The Luftwaffe had chosen Manchester with surgical precision. This was Britain's industrial arsenal, churning out ammunition, aircraft parts, and military vehicles from factories that had pivoted from peacetime production. Trafford Park alone employed 75,000 workers across 200 factories. Destroying Manchester meant crippling Britain's war effort. Hitler's bombers came loaded with incendiaries designed to create firestorms in the densely packed city center. The first bombs fell on the Cathedral Quarter, ancient timber-frame buildings erupting into flame within minutes. Fire crews racing through blacked-out streets found hydrants that barely functioned, their water pressure pathetically weak against infernos that merged into walls of fire. The wind, sweeping across open bomb sites, turned individual blazes into a single roaring conflagration. Medieval lanes that had survived 7 centuries vanished in 7 hours. The Free Trade Hall, that temple to Manchester's commercial glory where Disraeli and Gladstone had thundered their speeches, took a direct hit. The building that had hosted the Halle Orchestra and witnessed the birth of the suffragette movement collapsed inward, its grand hall becoming a smoking crater. Nearby, the Royal Exchange, nerve center of the cotton trade, survived structurally but saw its magnificent trading floor pierced by bombs that crashed through glass dome and timber beams. The Luftwaffe returned on December 23rd. This time they targeted the industrial districts, their bombers following railway lines toward factory concentrations. The Christmas Blitz, as Mancunians would remember it, killed over 600 people across 2 nights. Another 3,000 suffered injuries. 75,000 homes sustained damage, leaving families to celebrate Christmas in rest centers and emergency shelters, their possessions reduced to ash. Yet the factories kept running. Workers arrived for morning shifts to find windows blown out and roofs collapsed, stepping over rubble to reach machines somehow still operational. At Metropolitan Vickers, production of aircraft components never stopped. Ford's Trafford Park plant, building military vehicles, had assembly lines functioning within days of being bombed. Women who had lost their homes worked 12-hour shifts before returning to temporary accommodation in schools and church halls. The bombing continued intermittently until 1944, though never again with the Christmas Blitz's concentrated fury. Manchester's skyline bore permanent scars. Gutted buildings, empty plots where entire blocks once stood, churches reduced to shells. The city centre, that Victorian showcase of Gothic revival and commercial ambition, lay devastated. But something unexpected emerged from the destruction. Manchester refused to break. Families sheltered in Anderson shelters buried in back gardens, emerging each morning to assess damage and carry on. Shop owners whose premises lay in ruins set up temporary stalls. Bus drivers navigated streets cratered with bomb damage, maintaining routes with dogged determination. The spirit that had built cotton mills and defied corn laws now faced German bombers, and found it possessed reserves of stubborn endurance that surprised even itself. By 1945, as peace finally arrived, Manchester could count its losses. Over 1,000 dead, 30,000 buildings destroyed or damaged, a city center requiring complete reconstruction. The question facing this battered metropolis was simple. What kind of city would rise from these ruins? The answer arrived on June 21, 1948, in a cramped laboratory at Manchester University. A machine the size of a wardrobe hummed to life, covered in switches and vacuum tubes that glowed amber in the dim light. For 17 minutes, it performed calculations that would have taken a human mathematician hours. This was the baby, the world's first stored program computer, and it represented Manchester's future as surely as spinning jennies had represented its past. The baby was crude, holding barely 1,000 bits of memory. Yet it proved something revolutionary. A machine could store instructions in electronic memory and modify its own program while running. Within the academic community, the implications rippled outward immediately. Computing would never again require manual rewiring for each new task. Alan Turing arrived at Manchester's mathematics department in September 1948, drawn by the baby's potential. The brilliant mathematician who had cracked the Enigma code at Bletchley Park now saw in this primitive machine the possibility of artificial intelligence. Could a machine think? Turing posed the question that would haunt computer science for generations, working in a Victorian building still bearing bomb damage from the Blitz, developing theories about machine learning while the city outside struggled with far more concrete problems. By February 1951, Ferranti Limited delivered the Mark I, the world's first commercially available computer, to Manchester University. It cost £87,000, weighed 5 tons, and consumed 25 kilowatts of power. Only 9 would ever be built, but they represented Manchester's transformation from industrial manufacturing to information technology, from mechanical looms to electronic brains. Yet, while scientists pushed computing forward, the city faced grimmer realities. The bomb sites remained, gaps in the urban fabric like missing teeth. Housing shortages reached crisis levels. Families doubled up in damaged Victorian terraces, waiting years for new accommodation. The cotton industry, weakened before the war, collapsed completely as India and other former colonies built their own textile mills. Manchester's traditional economic engine had finally seized. The city council responded with ambitious reconstruction plans. New housing estates rose on the city's periphery, Wythenshawe expanded southward, absorbing green fields into streets of semi-detached homes with gardens and indoor plumbing. Harper Hay and Blackley sprouted tower blocks, vertical villages designed to house thousands. These estates promised modern living for working-class families accustomed to cramped back-to-backs without bathrooms. The reality proved less utopian. The new estates sat miles from employment centers, connected by inadequate transport links. Families relocated from tight-knit slum communities found themselves isolated in identical houses on identical streets, severed from the corner shops and pubs that had anchored neighborhood life. The tower blocks, built cheap and fast, developed problems within years: faulty heating, poor ventilation, lifts that constantly broke down. Meanwhile, the city center reconstruction moved at glacial pace. Empty bomb sites became car parks, temporary solutions that lasted decades. The blackened shells of bombed buildings stood as grim reminders, budgets insufficient for demolition, let alone rebuilding. Piccadilly remained half-ruined. Market Street shops operated from patched premises with boarded windows. Manchester in the 1950s occupied strange contradictions. In university laboratories, scientists developed computers that would transform global communications and commerce. On surrounding streets, families lived in conditions that would have seemed familiar to Victorians: outside toilets, shared yards, coal fires that filled rooms with smoke. The city that had pioneered the Industrial Revolution now struggled to navigate the transition to whatever came next. Yet the presence of the computer lab suggested possibilities. Manchester had always reinvented itself. From medieval market town to textile capital to industrial powerhouse. Perhaps these glowing vacuum tubes represented not just scientific achievement, but economic salvation. As the 1950s drew to a close, that question remained unanswered. But the 60s would bring dramatic changes that nobody quite expected. The final cotton mill closed its doors in 1968. Workers filed out for the last time, carrying toolboxes and photographs, leaving behind machinery that would be sold for scrap. The building stood silent, its tall windows reflecting empty sky. For nearly 2 centuries, the rhythm of looms had defined Manchester's soundscape. Now that rhythm had stopped. The numbers told a devastating story. In 1951, Manchester's textile industry still employed over 100,000 workers. By 1970, fewer than 10,000 remained. The mills themselves, those massive brick monuments to industrial capitalism, became obsolete overnight. Some were demolished. Others stood abandoned, their windows broken, floors rotting, becoming homes for pigeons and symbols of economic collapse. The ship canal, once bustling with cargo ships from around the world, witnessed similar decline. Traffic volumes collapsed as containerization revolutionized global shipping. The canal's docks couldn't handle the massive new container ships, and Manchester's geographical disadvantage became insurmountable. Why transport goods 40 miles inland when Liverpool could process them directly at the coast? By 1975, tonnage had dropped to a fraction of its peak, and the warehouses along the canal's banks stood empty, slowly decaying. People fled. Between 1961 and 1981, Manchester's population dropped from 662,000 to 449,000. Families with options moved to suburban towns offering newer housing, better schools, and cleaner air. They settled in Altrincham, Stockport, Bolton, commuting back into the city for work but living elsewhere. The population loss accelerated with each passing year, creating a devastating cycle. Fewer residents meant less tax revenue, which meant deteriorating services, which drove more people away. The inner city hollowed out. Terraced houses stood empty with boarded windows. Shops closed as customers vanished. Entire streets became ghost towns, haunted by memories of corner shops and crowded pavements. Moss Side, Holme, and Coates transformed into landscapes of dereliction. Unemployment soared past 20% in some areas. Young people grew up surrounded by decay, their futures as uncertain as the abandoned factories dominating their neighborhoods. Holme became the most visible symbol of planning disasters. In the late 1960s, the council demolished vast swaths of Victorian terraces, replacing them with 4 massive concrete crescents housing 13,000 people. Designed to replicate Georgian elegance in modern materials, the crescents instead became monuments to brutalist failure. The deck access corridors meant to create streets in the sky became wind tunnels and crime corridors. The concrete construction allowed sound to travel between flats, making privacy impossible. Heating systems failed constantly. Damp penetrated walls. Within years, the crescents earned the nickname Fort Holme, their walkways patrolled by gangs, their courtyards littered with debris. Crime rates climbed. Drug dealing became endemic. Police avoided certain areas after dark. Social services struggled to cope with mounting problems: child poverty, domestic violence, mental health crises. The optimism of the 50s, when new housing promised better lives, had curdled into bitter reality. The tower blocks and crescents didn't solve problems. They concentrated and amplified them. Manchester in the 70s presented a landscape of urban decline that shocked even those who remembered the Blitz. At least bombing damage promised reconstruction. This decay felt permanent, inevitable, terminal. The factories would never reopen. The mills would never run again. The economic foundation upon which the city had been built for 2 centuries had simply vanished. Yet, in university laboratories and small offices, something else was stirring. Those early computers had evolved, growing more powerful, more compact, more essential to modern commerce. Could information technology replace lost manufacturing? Could Manchester reinvent itself one final time? In 1980, few believed it possible. The city seemed finished. In a cramped rehearsal space on Erasmus Street, 4 young men were creating something entirely new. The year was 1976, and Joy Division sound emerged directly from Manchester's desolation. Ian Curtis sang with haunted intensity about isolation and despair, his voice echoing through post-industrial emptiness. Their music didn't escape the decay. It channeled it into art. Tony Wilson, a Granada television presenter with vision bordering on madness, founded Factory Records in 1978. He offered Joy Division a contract written in his own blood, a theatrical gesture that captured Factory's refusal to behave like a normal business. The label operated on principles more artistic than commercial, prioritizing creative freedom over profit margins. Factory's distinctive graphic design, created by Peter Saville, transformed record sleeves into modernist art objects. Then tragedy struck. On May 18, 1980, Ian Curtis hanged himself in his Macclesfield kitchen, hours before Joy Division's first American tour. He was 23 years old. The remaining members reformed as New Order, eventually fusing post-punk darkness with electronic dance music, creating tracks like Blue Monday that would become the best-selling 12-inch single ever released. Meanwhile, in Stretford, another revolution was brewing. The Smiths formed in 1982, pairing Johnny Marr's shimmering guitars with Morrissey's literate, deliberately English lyrics. While American MTV celebrated glamorous excess, Morrissey sang about provincial boredom, sexual confusion, and the mundane tragedies of working-class life. The Smiths made northern ordinariness artistically valid, their album covers featuring unknown Manchester faces instead of band photographs. Wilson's most audacious gamble opened in May 1982. The Hacienda nightclub occupied a former yacht showroom on Whitworth Street, designed by Ben Kelly with industrial materials: steel mesh, hazard stripes, raw concrete. For its first years, the club bled money spectacularly. Some nights attracted barely 50 people into a space built for 1,500. Factory records poured profits from New Order into keeping the Hacienda alive. Everything changed in 1987. Acid house music arrived from Chicago and Detroit, and the Hacienda became its British cathedral. DJ Mike Pickering played marathon sets to crowds dancing until dawn, fueled by ecstasy tablets flooding Manchester streets. The club transformed from commercial disaster to cultural phenomenon seemingly overnight. Wednesday nights drew thousands. The queue stretched around blocks. This was Madchester, a moment when music, drugs, and youth culture fused into something genuinely revolutionary. The Stone Roses combined 60s psychedelia with contemporary beats, their debut album capturing summery optimism entirely disconnected from Manchester's gray reality. Happy Mondays, fronted by wild man Shaun Ryder, brought working-class hedonism and twisted poetry to acid house rhythms. The fashion was deliberately anti-fashion. Baggy jeans, oversized shirts, bucket hats. The attitude was deliberately anti-London, a defiant assertion that creativity didn't require Southern validation. Manchester bands signed to Manchester labels, recorded in Manchester studios, partied in Manchester clubs. The city's decades of decline had paradoxically created freedom. Cheap rehearsal spaces in abandoned warehouses, no establishment to rebel against because the establishment had collapsed. By 1990, Manchester felt genuinely exciting for the first time in generations. Journalists descended from London and abroad, documenting this unlikely renaissance. Here was a city that should have been finished, somehow producing the most vital music in Britain. But the Hacienda's success contained seeds of destruction. Gang violence erupted as drug dealers fought for territory inside the club. The euphoria couldn't last. By 1992, the moment was ending, though its impact would echo for decades. Manchester had proven something crucial. Cities could reinvent themselves through culture, not just industry. Manchester's transformation from market town to industrial giant to modern metropolis reveals more than one city's story. It illuminates the possibilities and perils facing every post-industrial community seeking reinvention. Subscribe to explore more cities that shaped our world.